What exactly is at stake for the Atlanta Falcons entering the 2023 NFL Draft? And we'll also break down 20 prospects that the Falcons could rank highly on their draft board through the first 4 rounds.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, then this is the game definitely for you. All you have to do to download the game is visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores, and our listeners will get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. And guys, I thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So later in today's episode, we will be looking at a draft board. Got some graphics for you, better than the last time. So if you're checking us out on YouTube where you get the podcast the night before the audio drops, by all means, if you're listening to the audio, continue to listen to the audio. But if you just want to get the fun visuals, of course, come check us out on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. But we're starting off today's episode on this Thursday morning, as many of you guys, certainly the people listening to the audio version of the podcast, are listening to this, only a few hours before the draft. And let's talk about why this draft matters, right? And it's not going to be because reasons, that you often hear where people will basically say, oh, it's going to make or break this team. And if they get this pick right or this pick wrong, boom, everything falls out. Any longtime listener of this illustrious podcast, anybody that's out here being my everydayers, knows that I'm not a big believer in saviors. And as an aside, I feel like there's far too much discourse in today's NFL media that treats football kind of like basketball, where we kind of, in that sport, we marvel at the singular abilities of LeBron James and KD and Steph Curry, Trae Young to will their teams to victory. And, I feel like this has sort of bled into how we talk about quarterbacks in today's NFL, why, quarterbacks get all the credit when the team wins, all the blame when the team loses, all that stuff. But I digress. The point is football is a team sport. It's the ultimate team sport. It's about 11 guys, 22 guys, 48 guys, 53 guys, however many you want to put out there, working together to create a greater whole. And one team or one player, one pick is not going to make or break you. Certainly can help or hurt you, by no means. But you're never going to hear me say this pick or this draft is going to make or break this football team. It's about the accumulation of the 11 guys, the 22 guys, the 53 guys, right? The cumulative whole is going to make or break your success. But that being said, this draft does matter, right? And the reason why it matters is because the Falcons are a rebuilding team, and it feels like that notion gets lost a lot this offseason from people on both sides, right? The extremely positive people, more power to you, but they tend to take the approach that, hey, the Falcons, with one offseason of spending, have basically hit the fast forward button on their rebuild. And they basically skipped all the steps, and now they can go immediately to competing at the highest levels at the top of the NFC and the NFL. And it does feel like the opposite end of the spectrum is on the opposite side of the coin, which is the people that are often so overly critical of the Falcons and whatnot, is because they are also holding them to that standard of like, well, you're not a team that's going to compete at the top of the NFC or the NFL right now immediately. And so therefore they're failing, and therefore Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot are doing a bad job. Now, one of the benefits of doing this podcast is I've learned patience over the years. That's one of the benefits of needing to provide illustrious content for your first listen 5 days a week, is I don't feel as compelled to have to get every single take off that I have. I can wait till tomorrow. I can wait till next week. I can wait till next month, sometimes even next year, right? And so that patience in mind, I can be patient. We're 1 year fully into this rebuild, right? And I feel like this past year, where I was one of these people very critical of this regime, going back 9 months ago, but I feel like in the last 9 months, they've shown that this team is moving in the right direction. Now, maybe they're not moving at the pace that some people would prefer, but I hope they continue to move in that direction. And I think the draft is going to be able to allow them to continue moving in the right direction to a team that can be a playoff contending team and a perennial playoff contending team. And then with still forward momentum, maybe even more than that. The idea of playing meaningful games in January, maybe all of a sudden we're talking about in a couple of years playing meaningful games in the month of February. Who knows? Right? And I think whether they're able to achieve that is going to be in part due to the foundation that they continue to lay, that they've been laying for the last 2 drafts and will continue now for this 3rd draft in this 2023 draft by drafting well. Now, whether they draft well, whether they draft poorly, those are going to be the factors that determine their success long term. But here's the kicker. We're not going to know if they drafted well for several years now. And again, that goes back to the point of patience, right? We know that 3 years from now, we'll have the answers over whether or not this is a good draft, right? We can look back 3 years to the 2020 draft and say, it was a mixed bag, right? We know A.J. Terrell was a good pick. Marlon Davidson, not so much. Michael Walker, Jalen Hawkins, 4th round picks, solid depth guys, probably not more than that. Jury's still out on Matt Hennessy. Right? And I think, one of the things that's going to be fascinating watching this draft is what is the Falcons' answers at that left guard position that Matt Hennessy is currently penciled atop of. And it's going to kind of tell us how they feel about Matt Hennessy. If they're really confident in Matt Hennessy, they may not take a left guard. If they don't have that confidence in Matt Hennessy, maybe they do take a left guard. Right? And some of that is dependent on how much confidence they have in the current players, that they have drafted at that left guard position over the last couple of years. And, that's going to be also an important element about this draft because we're still in the process of really learning about this regime. We're now 3 years in, but we still haven't really figured this regime out fully, right? This offseason was the first time since they've gotten here that they've had the freedom to spend money in free agency. And this draft is going to be kind of an important period at the end of that sentence. It's not the end-all be-all. And the offseason isn't necessarily going to be over once we reach, 7 p.m. Eastern time Saturday when, Mr. Irrelevant is finally picked. There will be more moves made post-draft as there is with all NFL teams. But it's going to be interesting to see, okay, you now spent all this money. You now can draft. What are you going to do in the draft? Right? For example, if they take a guard high, right? Not only does that tell us what they think about Matt Hennessy, who was a Dimitroff draft pick, it also kind of tells us what they think about Jalen Mayfield and Justin Schaefer, right? Are they going to be more like the TD-led regime that tended to double down on their mistakes? And I don't want to necessarily throw Jalen Mayfield and Justin Schaefer under the bus. It's not necessarily fair to them to call them mistakes at this point in their limited NFL careers. But so far, the results that the Falcons have gotten from those 2 draft picks has not been particularly promising. And this goes back to a conversation that we were having when Terry Fontenot had his initial press conference when he was hired back in January 2021, right? And he talked about Ozzie Newsome as, someone that he looked up to. And one of the things that we've talked about many times on this podcast, and I'm sure many of you are tired of hearing the story, but, not everybody has been making this podcast their first listen for the last couple of years. They're new to the show, and they maybe haven't heard it yet. But I've often compared the difference between Ozzie Newsome and Thomas Dimitroff, boiling it down to 1 or 2 moves, right? Ozzie Newsome used their top pick with the Ravens in 2012 on a pass rusher and Courtney Upshaw. After 1 year, the Ravens were clear that Upshaw was not going to bring the juice opposite Terrell Suggs that they wanted at that position. So what did? They went out and got Elvis Dumervil, an all-pro player, a couple of years before it led the NFL in sacks in order to provide that pass rush. Meanwhile, you compare that to what Thomas Dimitroff did, taking Vic Beasley with his top pick in the 2015 draft, and the Falcons continually doubling down on, well, we're going to make Vic Beasley into a thing, right? And it's notable that Wednesday morning, Thomas Dimitroff was on a local radio station talking about that pick and Vic Beasley and how they kind of knew he wasn't necessarily passionate about it. I don't really care, right? I ain't about relitigating draft picks from 8 years ago. I ain't about that life, guys. I don't care what Thomas Dimitroff has to say about draft picks 8 years ago. Okay. But I am interested on that spectrum between Thomas Dimitroff, who's going to, stubbornly commit to their draft picks and believe that they can get the most out of those players on one end of the spectrum versus Ozzie Newsome, who the key of Ozzie Newsome to me was not necessarily Ozzie always got the pick right, but Ozzie understood and the Ravens understood that when they got it wrong, they would move off of it. And that kind of how the Falcons address the left guard position. Are they going to ride or die with Jalen Mayfield and Justin Schaefer? That would be what Dimitroff would do. Or are they going to solve that and get their long-term left guard in this year's draft? That's something, to me, what Ozzie Newsome would wind up doing. So we'll see what happens, guys. And my hope is, over this weekend and then over the ensuing 6 or so weeks that I'll pour through the film to break down the players that they get in this weekend, that all I need to really see from this team is a handful of players that I feel like can be contributors and solidify this foundation that this regime is building, form the core of what I think can be a successful NFL team for years to come. And we'll see if that happens. There's always a chance that I'll be on these reaction podcasts on Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, being like, I don't really see it with this guy. I hope we're not having those conversations, but we'll just have to sort of see. And, we'll continue today's episode talking about some of the players that, at least in my eyes, make sense for the Falcons. Some of these guys I'm a big fan of. Some of these guys I'm kind of lukewarm on. But players that I think are potentially on the Falcons draft board in the first 4 rounds at several key positions. We'll break it down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But I want to remind you guys that today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game. And of course, as you guys, check out draft coverage on your phones, on your television, on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, between Falcons picks, why not you pick up your phone, download Ultimate Football GM and be a GM yourself and draft the players. It's always fun to draft players in this mobile game. Ultimate Football GM is completely free. It's playable offline, so you can play on the go as you want, when you want. It's a very challenging, realistic game. You're always, drafting players like, hey, got to scout these guys, all this stuff. It's always fun with the draft. So make sure you check it out. And if you do, make sure you use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store, and you'll get 100% free boost to your franchise. Again, that's Locked On, LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. And if you want to download this game, go to ultimate-gm.com. Look it up in your app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com, Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So, guys, before we get into the Falcons' possible draft board, right, I want to give you a heads up that if you're looking for more coverage of the NFL draft and you're not just listening to Mel Kiper and Todd McShay do whatever they do on ESPN and, whoever's Daniel Jeremiah and whoever else is, Rich Eisen are on NFL Network. No shade at those guys. But, Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, the host of Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, are going to be doing a live show here for the Locked On Network. You can find it, starting at 7:30 Eastern time on the YouTube, on the Locked On NFL Scouting page. And they'll be doing live for rounds 1, 2, 3. And then on Saturday, they'll get you caught up for each round. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube. So let's get into the Falcons draft board. And this is originally from Lauren Cox, the host of Locked On Bears, and he did it for the Bears, and I modified it for the Falcons. And so, again, I'll do my best for the audio listeners to describe what they're seeing on the screen. But, graphic on front of you, you can see my hands. I'll be very animated behind this graphic. But basically, it's a sort of a draft board listing 5 positions and 4 potential targets with each of the Falcons' first-round picks, right? So the 5 positions I have listed here are offensive line, meaning guard, wide receiver, edge rusher, and we're going for all big edges, right? Interior D-line, right? And then defensive back, which is going to include both corners and safeties. And obviously, the Falcons draft board is going to be more than 20 players, right? But this is not meant to be comprehensive or anything like that. It's just meant to be sort of something that you guys, a little cheat sheet that you can keep in mind as we get through the draft. But on the first row for the 8th overall selection that the Falcons have in round 1, the players I have listed under offensive line is Peter Skoronski from Northwestern. Wide receiver is Jackson Smith and Jigma from Ohio State. The edge rusher is Tyree Wilson from Texas Tech. The defensive lineman is Jalen Carter from Georgia. And the defensive back is Devin Witherspoon, the cornerback from Illinois. And some of these guys I have varying degrees of confidence that the Falcons will potentially pick in round one. If I was to guess, any of these guys is the most likely pick, or at least the most logical pick to me, Peter Skoronski would be that guy, right? If the board falls a certain way, we talked about this yesterday with Bijan Robinson, the Texas running back, being a possibility that, I think Arthur Smith wants to bring in someone who embodies the toughness, grit, the physicality that he wants to instill as the identity of his football team. I think Skoronski checks that box. JSN, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, I don't think is a serious contender for the Falcons at 8, but in a world where the Falcons trade back a couple of spots, maybe they can start entertaining that as a possibility. I've mentioned before, I don't expect Jalen Carter to be the Falcons pick if he is available on the board at 8, even though he would be my pick because I see him as the best player in this draft, and I don't necessarily have the concerns about the off-field immaturity stuff that's surrounding Jalen Carter, but that's due to sheer ignorance because I don't really know enough about that to have concerns. So I just look at the player on the field. I think he's a great player. I would take him, but I don't think the Falcons are going to necessarily be in that mindset because they have more information than I do. Now, of course, at defensive back, you could easily swap out, Christian Gonzalez, the Oregon corner, for Devin Witherspoon here. I have the feeling that both of those guys are going to go off the board right before the Falcons pick at like 6 and 7. To Detroit, possibly Las Vegas, maybe the Cardinals if they move back, if Vegas and Arizona switch places, who knows? So I don't know if those guys are going to be on the board, but they'll be very tempting, either one of those guys, if they are available for that pick. And, of course, there are other edge rushers beyond Tyree Wilson, who a lot of people think is going to be potentially the number 2 overall selection for the Houston Texans. Some people think he might be the Arizona Cardinals selection at number 3 if they stay put there over Will Anderson. Who knows? But other edge rushers would include Will Anderson, the Alabama pass rusher, Nolan Smith of Georgia, outside linebacker Lucas Van Ness from Iowa, and Miles Murphy from Clemson. Now, we talked earlier this week about Nolan Smith being a possibility because there was a lot of heat for Nolan Smith over the weekend. That heat seems to be dying off over the last couple of days, but we'll just sort of have to see. To me, Nolan Smith, as I said before, doesn't make a ton of sense because the Falcons already have similar edges, undersized edges already on the roster, but maybe the Falcons believe that Nolan Smith has the right makeup that they, that he's the best player available, even if, he makes certain players like Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone and Bud Dupree and Arnold Ebiketie redundant at this point, but we'll see. So, again, we've spent 3 months talking about this pick. I don't really know, guys. Your guess is as good as mine. My best guess is Tyree Wilson would be the top guy on their board if available. If he's gone, then my next best guess is Peter Skoronski, Nolan Smith, and Bijan Robinson, the running back from Texas, as the most likely outcomes. And again, those latter two, especially Smith and Robinson, given a lot of chatter over the last couple of days that the Falcons want to move back. I think a lot of that may be driven by the probability that Tyree Wilson is not going to be available for the Falcons at pick 8. And so, if they move back 5 to 8 spots, there's a chance that, we spent 3 months talking about all these players and all of those players will be gone by the time the Falcons get on the clock and they wind up taking somebody that we haven't spent really any time talking about, such as Joey Porter Jr., the cornerback from Penn State, Brian Branch, the safety from Alabama, Deontay Banks, the cornerback from Maryland, just to name a couple of examples of guys that are expected to go somewhere in the teens or early 20s in this draft. So that's what kind of makes the draft fun, right? We don't know what's going to happen. But let's move on to round 2 with the Falcons at the 44th overall selection. And the players I have listed under offensive line is Steve Avila, the guard from TCU, Jonathan Mingo, the wide receiver from Ole Miss, Keon White, the edge rusher from Georgia Tech, Keanu Benton, the defensive tackle from Wisconsin, and Cam Smith, the cornerback from South Carolina. Now, Benton was a player that I picked in my Monday mock draft for the Falcons in this round 2 spot. It does sound like Jonathan Mingo's gone from like a day 3 guy to a second round pick possibly, so that's why he's penciled here. I've heard some light chatter that, Steve Avila might go in round 1. Right? There's been a lot of buzz that Keon White will go in round 1 since he's been invited to the draft and is expected to attend. And, Cam Smith might be having the opposite issue where he may be falling on the draft boards. Daniel Jeremiah and Dane Brugler both have him rated outside of their top 50 picks. And so maybe if the Falcons have a similar, they're targeting Cam Smith in round 3 as opposed to round 2. So, I have no idea how the Falcons are going to view these players, right? For example, I put Steve Avila here. Maybe the Falcons have a higher grade on Cody Mock, the North Dakota State offensive tackle, as a guard, possibly. Maybe the Falcons instead of Cam Smith, they maybe like his teammate at South Carolina, Darius Rushmore, and maybe they would target him at 44 and Cam Smith later in the draft. We simply don't know. Again, that's why the draft is fun. And basically my goal, guys, is to throw a lot of stuff at the wall, and hopefully, just hopefully, some of that stuff will stick. So we're going to continue the conversation here on today's Locked On Falcons and continue to throw stuff at the wall for the round 3 and round 4 options as we continue breaking down this possible rudimentary draft board here on Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, maybe as you guys are watching the draft, you get a little hangry, you get a little upset, right? When the Falcons zig, when you expect them to zag at this pick or whatever, and you're like, what are the Falcons doing? So you just need a little bit of pep in your step, and the perfect snack for you during these moments is Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Built Bars are delicious. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. They're low in sugar, though. They're low in calories, but they have a whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in great flavors. And for years, we told you to head on over to Built.com, check out their newest flavors. Use the promo code LOCKEDON15. You'll get 15% off your order. But now you can also go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get Built Bars. In Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. And if you're at Sam's, run in, grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro. Trust me, guys, you will thank me later. So as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to give another shout out to all my everydayers that make this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. And I hope you guys continue to do that. We will be later on Thursday. We'll be doing a live show. So that should be in your audio feed. It will be on the YouTube channel as well. Around 7 o'clock, that will be a lead-in to, the Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino live show on Locked On, which you'll probably see me at some point when the Falcons make their draft pick. We'll have plenty of content on the YouTube channel over the weekend, short videos reacting to most, if not all, the picks. But that live show around 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, it'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Again, I'm recording this current episode Wednesday afternoon. And so there will be 24 hours of stuff that will have happened between now and that next episode, although maybe many of you guys aren't listening to this till you get off work on Thursday at 5 p.m. But that's the plan for the live show. And then we'll do a live reaction to round 1, probably around midnight. That's usually when the first round ends, midnight Eastern time. And then, of course, throughout the weekend, we'll be doing our reactions to each day of the draft as well, to be posted at the end of, every night or whatever it is. So that's the plan for this weekend, guys. And check out the Discord. We'll probably do something on Saturday with a symposium, Twitter space type of thing as well. We'll see how I can handle that as I try to cover all my bases. So that will be something to keep an eye on if you want to check out the Locked On Falcons Discord. It's linked in the description below. But anyway, let's continue the conversation looking at the third round of this mock-up draft board that I have. And the listed players I have for the offensive guard is Chandler Zavala, the NC State guard. Wide receiver is Rashee Rice from SMU. The edge rusher is Zach Harrison from Ohio State. The D lineman is Zach Pickens from South Carolina. And the defensive back is Illinois safety Jartavius Quan Martin. And, I'm sure some of you guys may have not heard of some of these names, right? So Zavala played left guard at NC State. Last year was next to Ike Ekwonu, the Panthers' first-round pick. And he has that coaching connection, right? The Falcons' assistant offensive line coach, Sean Flaherty, I think, was also working with the offensive line the last couple of years in NC State before joining the Falcons a year ago. Rashee Rice was a player that I had pegged for the Falcons in round 3 in my Monday mock. He's a kind of another contested catch guy, possession receiver, can block, basically the Arthur Smith prototype at the receiver position. We'll see if the Falcons veer off of that course. Zach Harrison's big, long, strong, raw, unrefined, but a nice developmental option if you're looking for a big edge. Zach Pickens, not a great run defender, but he does bring some juice as a pass rusher. And you do have that SC connection where the defensive coordinator at South Carolina was also part of that NC State staff that several Falcons assistants have been part of recently, a couple of years back. Illinois also fits that because a former NC State staffer is the defensive coordinator there and also coached the defensive backs. And this is why on this graphic, you see 3 Illinois Illini DBs on it, right? And I'm not saying it's going to be guaranteed, but if you ran up to me and said, hey, Aaron, I'm from the future, right? And the Falcons don't draft a single defensive player from South Carolina or Illinois, I wouldn't be totally shocked, but I would be somewhat surprised, right? It feels like we're going to get at least one of these guys. at some point that has this coaching connection. And in this instance, Jartavius Quan Martin is a safety nickel hybrid. He played pretty much exclusively in the slot at Illinois the last 2 years, but has safety skills. Basically, it's the idea that if you don't get Brian Branch in round 1, you could potentially get Martin in round 2 or 3 at some point. So moving on to round 4, pick 110. The listed players I have is Nick Broker, the offensive guard from Ole Miss, A.T. Perry, the wide receiver from Wake Forest, Isaiah McGuire, the edge rusher from Missouri, Moro Ajomo, the D tackle from Texas, and Sidney Brown, the safety from Illinois. Right, Broker was a player that when I watched him a year ago at Ole Miss, when he was the blindside protector for Matt Corral, future Panther, by the way, or current Panther, by the way. Basically I called him a mean version of Wes Schweitzer. So that's kind of what he brings to the table. Solid 4th round pick in my eyes, if the Falcons can't get their left guard earlier in the draft. A.T. Perry, big possession receiver that wins contested catches and can block, right? The Arthur Smith prototype, right? And as I said earlier, we're going to learn a lot about this regime. And I'm very curious to see what type of receiver they add, right? Maybe they give the Jets a call, right? Now that they've acquired Aaron Rodgers, maybe they're looking to move on from Corey Davis. Maybe we offer up one of these picks for Corey Davis and the Jets oblige. Who knows? But if the Falcons do draft a wide receiver, is it going to be another one of these big-bodied contested catch guys? Or do they look for someone who can actually separate, the number one skill that a wide receiver needs in the NFL, or someone that adds some explosiveness to the position? That's what I think the Falcons need, but, Arthur Smith going to Arthur Smith. So if you're wondering why Aaron hates A.T. Perry, if you've gotten that vibe from previous episodes of the podcast, basically, as far as I'm concerned, A.T. stands for Auden Tate, right? Now, I think A.T. Perry's better than Auden Tate, but to me, one of the frequent criticisms I have for this regime is that they tend to have a very specific type of player that they like, and that's all they like, right? They tend to stockpile the same type of player, and it often leads to only one version of one of those guys succeeding because these player skill sets don't complement each other, right? It's about the team, right? 11 guys that complement each other. And to me, it's not a coincidence that Drake London, Auden Tate, Brian Edwards did not blossom here in Atlanta as so many people were hoping for a year ago, right? Because they're all kind of the same player, and clearly Drake London is the best version of that player. And so if you have Drake London, why do you need Auden Tate? Why do you need Brian Edwards, as we found out over the course of last year? So, A.T. Perry could be a player that goes on to some other team and blossoms there, right? And people will be like, oh, you hated A.T. Perry. And it's like, I didn't hate A.T. Perry. I hated him in Atlanta, right? He could go blossom somewhere else because they don't have that type of player, and he could go out there and fill that niche. But we'll see. As for Isaiah McGuire, he's a guy that I've only recently started watching his film, and I really like his film. There's certain players that are being mocked to go in the top 10, or, Lucas Van Ness, that I think Isaiah McGuire is a better pass rusher than, right? Powerful pass rusher, has an array of moves, unlike Lucas Van Ness, who's just a power rusher, right? Not quite the athlete that LVN is, but we'll see. So McGuire would be a very good get in the middle rounds of this draft. Ojomo, a Shrine Bowl attendee. We know the Falcons were one of the coaching staffs at the Shrine Bowl this past year. And I think we could see several Shrine Bowl players targeted by the Falcons on day 3 of the draft. Ojomo is a long but kind of undersized guy to be a full-time interior player, but I could see him as kind of a option similar to Calais Campbell that could be sort of a big end that can play inside, outside, depending on, down distance, all that stuff, base in, nickel, D lineman, maybe, who knows? And so speaking of the Shrine Bowl, we know that the Falcons also love Senior Bowl guys. That is where the bulk of their draft picks have been. And you'll notice on these lists, no Senior Bowl guys in the first round, because usually the Senior Bowl is not putting out first round guys. Most of those guys opt out of the game. But 4 out of the 5 second rounders I have listed, Avila, Bingo, White, and Benton, were at the Senior Bowl. 3 out of 5 third rounders I have listed were Senior Bowl guys. It's Rice, Pickens, and Martin. And 3 out of 5 fourth rounders, Broker, McGuire, and Brown, were also at the Senior Bowl. And of course, Perry and Ajomo were at the Shrine Bowl. So wrapping up, Brown completes the set of Illinois DBs, although Kendall Smith is another DB that's draftable, projecting as a late round undrafted guy, another safety for Illinois. But Brown is a versatile player, can play the box, he's not the biggest guy, but has been primarily used at Illinois as a box safety, can play in the slot, all that stuff. We had Savion Mixon on the podcast, I believe, yesterday, talking about, Sidney Brown. So if you want to get more insight into that, go check out yesterday's episode as your second listen today. So that's going to do it for us, guys, here on the draft board section, and we'll wrap up today's episode. And basically, I hope I've given you a good enough spread of information that at least when we get to draft night, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that some of the players the Falcons wind up picking, you've actually heard, right? Over the next month or so, we'll explore who the Falcons actually take fully, right? My pre-draft goal is to know a little about a lot of guys, and my post-draft goal is to know a lot about a handful of guys that the Falcons actually do take. So that's what you guys can look in store for your first listen. Of course, continue to check us out all throughout the weekend. A lot of content coming your way here on Locked On Falcons, both on YouTube as well as your preferred podcast platforms for the audio. Check out the Locked On NFL Scouting live show throughout the night. I'm sure I'll probably be making an appearance on other people's live draft shows over the course of the weekend. Probably Friday night, I'll be ducking in and out of various places and hang out in Discord so that you can, chat live with your fellow Locked On listeners, your first listeners, your everydayers, all that stuff in the Discord, link in the description below. So, guys, really appreciate you joining me for the penultimate pre-draft episode. We'll do one more, right? 7 p.m. Eastern time, live on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. But we're inching closer to that. So we'll see what the Falcons do, and hopefully we come away with still positive vibes from this draft class rather than being like, I don't know about this guy, So we'll see what happens. I'm a kid on Christmas. You just don't know what you're gonna get. Sometimes you get a shiny red bicycle, sometimes you get a candy apple. It's like, hey, there's nothing wrong with a candy apple, but it's like 4 bites and you're like, okay, I'm done with this. I don't need this, right? So I don't know why that was the thing that popped in my head, candy apple as a disappointing Christmas gift, but that was the thing. Clearly, my brain is not normal, but how could I be normal doing this, talking about the Falcons every single day? All right. Anyway, guys, I'm rambling at the end of the show. That's going to do it for us here. Really appreciate you. Continue to check us out as your first listen. We're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every